Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. I caught up with my guest today, Ambassador Karen Pierce, in the middle of a very intense day of diplomacy on February 22nd. She is the United Kingdom's ambassador to the United States, and earlier that morning, Boris Johnson announced new British sanctions on certain Russian oligarchs and financial institutions. This was followed by similar sanctions announcements by the European Union and the United States later in the day. These new sanctions come after Vladimir Putin's government formally recognized the independence of two regions of eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. This specific set of sanctions from the UK, the EU, and the USA seem to be a very calibrated and coordinated response to this provocation, which we discuss at the outset of this interview. So a big thank you to Ambassador Karen Pierce and the team at the British Embassy for helping to put this together. We recorded our conversation live via Twitter Spaces, and Karen Pierce very graciously took some questions from the audience as well, though for the purposes of this podcast episode, that portion has been edited out. To be alerted of a live recording of the podcast, please just follow me on Twitter at Mark L. Goldberg. All right, now here is my conversation with the United Kingdom's ambassador to the United States, Karen Pierce.
I'd love to hear this directly from you, but it certainly looks like the unified strategy now is to impose a first set of what might be considered like medium hard sanctions in response to provocations thus far, while holding back on a more intense and sweeping set of sanctions in order to deter a potential further Russian incursion into Ukraine. Given what we've seen today from the UK, the EU, and most recently the USA, is that a fair description of the Allied plan thus far?
Well, thanks very much, Mark. And yes, that's exactly right. Over the preceding weeks, the US, the EU, and the UK have been getting together at expert level to make sure that if sanctions were needed, then we coordinated. We coordinate on what areas they cover, which banks, which people, for example, and we coordinate on sequencing. And you're absolutely right. This is a first tranche of sanctions designed to respond to what the Russians did yesterday by recognizing the Donetsk and Luhansk republics and by moving troops forward. We stand poised to introduce much more sweeping sanctions if aggression doesn't stop.
And can you maybe take us behind the scenes a little bit? Like, how did this plan come to be? And like, what were some of the key debates and decisions in developing the plans? I mean, as the UK ambassador to the US, I have to imagine you like in the room when these plans are decided. Can you give us some indication, some color behind the scenes of what these debates were like?
Well, I'll try to do that. Sanctions are actually a very specialized area of diplomatic and foreign policy, and you often need a wet towel to get your head around them because they're complicated because of legislation, complicated in terms of using intelligence sensibly and working out who can legitimately be targeted. And you have to do that in a way that would stand up in a court of law if you were challenged. So it's not straightforward. We spend a lot of time pooling information and evidence with our American and EU colleagues. We in Britain have had to introduce new legislation about sanctions. When we were in the European Union, all our sanctions came either through the EU or through the United Nations. Outside the EU, we would still apply UN sanctions, but we've had to bring in special legislation. And in fact, the legislation that enabled us to make today's announcement on 3 individuals and 5 Russian banks, that was laid before Parliament on 10th of February. So we've moved pretty fast, but we are doing this in lockstep with the Europeans and the Americans.
So that's an interesting point you make. Since leaving the European Union, the United Kingdom needs a parliamentary action to pass sanctions. Has that sort of complicated the efforts thus far?
No, it hasn't complicated them, actually, Mark. It's enabled us to be more flexible and targeted, and also enabled us to move very quickly. So we began a few years ago with what we call Magnitsky sanctions. These are human rights sanctions, enabling us to get the assets and travel bans on certain individuals violating and abusing human rights. We took a leaf out of America's own legislation for that. But it has meant that we needed different legislation in order to bring in the sorts of sanctions against the Russian banks and individuals that you saw today. So we're working on that, and we stand ready to bring forward further legislation to enable us to curtail the ability of the Russian state and Russian companies to raise funds in our markets and prohibit a range of high-tech exports if we need to do that, if aggression doesn't get rolled back.
So, further to that, what else might we expect from the United Kingdom specifically in a next round of sanctions should it come to it?
Well, I don't want to be too precise because a lot of it will depend on what is actually happening on the ground. But what the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary were referring to today is sanctions against those members of the Duma, the Russian Parliament, who voted to recognize the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk. They're also talking about new trade measures, extending the measures that already applied to Crimea after Russia's invasion in 2014, extending those so that no UK company will find itself inadvertently supporting Russia's illegal recognition of the Donbass and Luhansk. And then we will be coordinating with the EU and the Americans to limit the ability of the Russian state and Russian companies to raise funds in the capital markets, as I said, further isolate Russian banks from the global economy.
So you came on my radar as a diplomat at the United Nations, which I cover pretty closely as editor of UN Dispatch. But I do know that you spent much of your career as a diplomat focused on Russia. Given what you know about Putin, what sort of sanctions might be effective in deterring a full-scale Russian assault on Ukraine? If he has made the decision to mount that full-scale assault, will any sort of set of sanctions be a deterrent?
Well, I think your last point's a very good one, Mark. I think there is something that we saw in the Putin address yesterday that goes beyond rationality in his attacks, his verbal attacks on Ukraine. So it's a good question to ask. Nevertheless, we hope for the best as we plan for the worst. So we do have this bigger package, and we do hope that will act as a deterrent on further aggression. But the odds must be that that is not possible. And sadly, the odds must also be that diplomacy cannot immediately resolve this. So we need to stand ready. One of the lines of thought in going after the oligarchs and the banks that we have done today is precisely because they're close to Putin. We hope that might exert a particular effect. We have gone after banks that have supported annexation in Crimea, who support Putin's defense moves, who support the integration of Crimea in the Russian financial sector. So we are trying to target these so that people in Putin's inner circle are personally hurt and targeted by these measures, and hopefully they will bring that home to President Putin. But I just want to add, if I may, going back to the point that, will anything deter him? I think it's very striking that President Putin spent the last few weeks telling everybody what a threat NATO was to Russia. And NATO has not actually done anything other than reinforce its own members. And it's President Putin who has rolled the tanks into Ukrainian sovereign territory. So I think that tells you a lot about his real aim.
I mean, given just how much we seem to be on like the precipice of something truly cataclysmic happening in Europe. Do any off ramps exist to your knowledge? Any diplomatic off ramps exist at the moment? Is there any opportunity you see for this not to escalate further? Of course, the decision being all mostly Putin's. What opportunities exist for de-escalation, if any?
I think you're right. The decision is Putin's, and it's part of the Putin game plan to make sure that we can't quite figure out which of several options he might pick. In my experience, he always runs more than one option at once. But I do want to stress, for the benefit of the listeners, that the opportunities are there, and they have always existed. Putin could have used all the European security and stability measures. Europe is the most overly lawyered up place in the world for stability and security agreements. And there are very many, ranging from the Human Rights Helsinki Final Act to the commitment not to cross borders and use force that you find in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. You have Putin, you have Russia agreements with the EU and NATO. There are a great many instruments that could have been used. The Americans tried to use them. They tried to have bilateral talks, and NATO offered NATO-Russia Council meetings. All those mechanisms are still there if President Putin wants to take them. But I think, as we were just saying, there now has to be a real doubt as to whether he ever wanted diplomacy to resolve this.
So I'm curious to get a sense from you what broader geopolitical implications might result from a potential Russian incursion into Ukraine. Specifically drawing on your experience as an ambassador at the United Nations, where for things to happen at the Security Council, you need just like the routine day-to-day cooperation between Russia and the West on matters far from Russia and the West, from peacekeeping in the Central African Republic, mandate renewals, things like that. To what extent do you see that a Russian invasion of Ukraine, a full-scale invasion, may impact other aspects of routine diplomacy at the United Nations and beyond?
Well, your general point is true, Mark. But the Security Council over the past 5 years, shall we say, has shown itself capable of dealing with second-order issues, including some quite difficult issues with Russia and China. And then where it tends to struggle is on the first-order issues, of which Russia's invasion of Ukraine is absolutely the most important development against European security that we have seen, possibly since the end of World War II in 1945, and certainly since the Bosnia Wars in the 1990s. So, it's such a serious move. But the Security Council did debate it last night. On the geostrategic and geopolitical implications, I will simply quote the Kenyan ambassador. Kenya is on the Security Council, and he called it an act of neo-colonialism. So I would hope that what President Putin is now faced with is the opprobrium of the world, particularly all those in the world who believe in open societies. It is an article of the UN Charter that you do not use force against another country. You do not cross borders using force. So I would hope that out of this, difficult as it is, comes a reaffirmation from a very large part of the UN's members of all those important rules that govern international affairs, because it has been Russia and China's aim for the past few years to actually disrupt those rules and to try and have a competition to see who sets the rules of global affairs. So I'm hopeful that what we will see is the world pushing back on President Putin's adventurism.
We're not hearing a tremendous amount of discussion, at least here in American media, about the potential humanitarian fallout from a Russian invasion of Ukraine and the refugee crisis it may provoke, particularly in Poland. Obviously, you can't speak to your intelligence assessments, but how are you perceiving and how concerned are you about the humanitarian implications of a war in Ukraine, a large war in Ukraine, and what impact might that have on European security, in NATO countries like Poland and other countries like Hungary that border Ukraine?
It's a very important part of the whole equation, and one reason why we, even at this late stage, appeal to President Putin not to go any further and to de-escalate and pull back. A certain amount of planning is going on at NATO and in the European Union on possible humanitarian scenarios. We ourselves, as the Brits, the Prime Minister has told the NATO Secretary General that we will have 1,000 more British troops ready to go to support a humanitarian response. And we have recently given a large chunk of money, which I think is about $70 million, but I'd have to check that, to support a future humanitarian response. So it's something we watch incredibly carefully alongside all our measures to return to security and stability in this important part of Europe.
I guess lastly, obviously much of your time is focused, rightly so, on the crisis in Ukraine, but there are other global crises that also ought to demand your attention and the attention of top diplomats around the world. To what extent does a major crisis like this distract or upend or otherwise impact your ability to focus on other key areas like Afghanistan or conflict in Ethiopia or other areas that are relevant and important to British foreign policy?
In my experience, Mark, when you get another crisis added to the ones we're already dealing with, particularly when it's one of this magnitude, it means everybody works longer hours and they work harder, because we've got to make sure that we don't take our eyes off these other crises while we're dealing with this terribly important one in the heart of Europe. It typically means we pull people off lesser priority work. So in the embassy, for example, we have a bunch of people working really hard, including through the night, to monitor what's happening, to liaise with the Americans, to liaise with other embassies here and send advice back to the UK. And some of those people are drawn from sections in the embassy that don't typically deal with foreign policy. And I think you find that's how it is in most capitals. But you're absolutely right. We also need to keep a very close eye on what is happening elsewhere in case some other bad guys decide to take advantage of the fact that a lot of attention is focused on Ukraine at the moment. So it's not easy, but we redouble our efforts basically.
Aside from the military front, diplomatically, are there any indicators or inflection points coming up in the next day or two or hour or two that you'll be looking towards that will suggest to you how this situation may evolve?
Well, one would watch for signs of de-escalation or an intent to de-escalate that might encourage diplomatic moves. I don't want to mislead anybody and have you go away thinking those moves are imminent. We have seen no sign of them. But alongside watching what the Russians are going to do next militarily, and watching what the Ukrainian military and indeed ordinary people are going to do about what the Russians do, one would obviously watch for any hint that the Russians were, even at this stage, prepared to go back to some sort of diplomatic route. So we're all alert for this. We keep in touch with the Americans and the Europeans and our friends in the Eastern Europe and throughout NATO, and we pool information and we pool our assessments to make sure we don't miss anything important. But I'm afraid I can't hold out much hope.
Well, Ambassador, thank you so much for your time, for taking questions from me, and for graciously taking questions from my audience. We appreciate it, and good luck these next few hours and days. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much for having me. Thanks for all the questions.
All right, thank you all for listening. Thank you to Ambassador Pierce for her time on an exceedingly intense day of Russia-focused diplomacy. These events on the ground are seemingly changing by the hour, but I think this conversation will give you some insight into how a top government official is approaching these key questions regarding Russia and Ukraine. All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.